Shalom, dear friends, and welcome to this installation of our Bible study, the Bible on 1 foot. Let me see if I can bring the main screen up here. There we go, the Bible on 1 foot. And the subtitle indicates that today we will be talking about the dispensation or the age of promise. Now, let me go back to the chart that I accidentally had on the screen before. This is just the next chart in our book of charts by Alfred Eade, the theologian and the artist who put these charts together. And once again, I'm indebted to him and also the family publishing company, Oak Knoll Publishers, that make these charts and the Bible study material by Dr. Eade available to people. Also appreciation to them for the permission that they have given me to make use of these charts in training disciples of our gracious God. So a little commercial there. This dispensation, this fourth dispensation, is called the Age of Promise. But in the previous dispensations, which would be innocence, conscience, and human government, one of the things we've noticed about all three of those eras of biblical history is that they're just full of promises by God. But each one of these eras, each one of these dispensations is given a title of the probably the most significant theme of the scriptures during that period of time. And I think the promises of God is definitely an appropriate theme for the material that we will be looking at today. You will notice that as we continue forward in biblical history into what will be kind of the future, God will continue to make promises. Even after the most important promise, the promise of the coming of the seed of woman, the Messiah and Redeemer of all mankind, God continues to make promises. He makes promises to those who believe in Yeshua, the Messiah. He makes promises about the future, many of which have yet to be fulfilled in human history and experience. So again, we're just going to be emphasizing promise today and highlighting some of the more important promises that God makes. And this is an appropriate thing for us to understand as we look at the various periods of history. For example, the age of conscience. After the fall of mankind into sin, God's major means of communicating with people is through the conscience. And so the age of conscience is labeled accordingly. But God, using the conscience to communicate with people, continues through the next dispensation, the age of human government. We will notice in our studies for today that God continues to use the conscience to communicate with people. And by the way, all of the dispensations that we've studied so far took place before the Bible was written. The first books of the Bible were written by Moses. I should say the most well-known of the early books of the Bible were written during the life of Moses, which is about 1500 BC. So for what would that be, 2,500 years between the Garden of Eden and the beginning of the writing of the books of the Bible, there is no Bible. So all of the communication between God and man takes place conversationally, mainly within the realm of the human conscience, the part of us, like I said before, it comes as standard equipment And it's the main way that God communicates to people, not as reliable as the Bible. So we're fortunate to have the Bible. But that continues on through all of the dispensations. It continues today. It will continue into the future. Conscience is a very important means of God communicating with people. So I guess what I want to emphasize is that when we focus on the themes for these various dispensations, don't get the idea that that theme disappears or comes to an end just because a new dispensation, a new era of God's dealing with man picks up. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the details here. At the bottom of the page is kind of a list of the themes that we will be covering today. The first is the call of Abram. That was Abraham's name before God changed it a little bit later in our story. His son is Isaac or Yitzhak. And Yitzhak's son is Yaakov, and then we have the children of Israel, which is all the sons of Jacob. One of those sons, Joseph, will be spending some time in Egypt, and that time will kind of be good and bad for Joseph. But ultimately, he will rise to a position of prominence there. But that will be followed by a period of bondage for Joseph and all of his family members, who, because of circumstances, because of a famine, a severe famine in the land of Canaan where they were living, had to go down to Egypt to survive, and did so and prospered there for a lengthy period of time until they ultimately became slaves of one of the kings of Egypt, and suffered miserably because of it. And that is followed by the Exodus. I will mention here that Dr. Eads' material would have us study the Exodus here in this dispensation of promise. But I am going to save that for the next lesson because even he mentions that the fourth dispensation, the dispensation of promise, ends in bondage. It ends here, not in the Exodus. But I'm glad the Exodus is pictured on the right-hand side of our chart, because it's important, and it is kind of the gospel hope. It is the promise that we have to look forward to, because this dispensation is going to end on kind of a negative note, a note of judgment. One of the things that I need to point out is that this chart picks up where the last one left off. You'll remember in the age of human government, that began with Noah's Ark, and after the flood, Noah and his three sons and all of their wives left the ark and began to repopulate the earth. And initially, the various branches of the family tree were separated, and they were dispersing around the planet as God instructed them to do. But then we came across Nimrod and the Babylonian religion, which is just kind of another name for a satanic religion that has continued on through the ages and continues to be very influential today. And that Babylonian religion of Nimrod kind of prompted people to desire to gather together and centralize their government, take on huge projects because of the massive populations and all the resources that they brought together. And they were going to build the Tower of Babel, or the Tower of Bavel, as it's known in the Hebrew. God did not approve of that. He did not approve of global centralized government. And so he confused the languages of the people there at the Tower of Babel. And once again, on the last chart, remember that the different family trees, the different nations, the different populations kind of branched off again. And of course, all of those different branches of the family tree are descended from Noah and his three sons. And so on this chart, the continuation is that towards the top of the chart where my cursor is, that would be the descendants of Ham. And who would they be? It would consist of the Ethiopians. These are mainly African peoples. The Libyans lived in North Africa. They were descendants of Put, one of the descendants of Ham. As time went on, the Phoenicians and the Canaanites, and those would be people who live in modern day Lebanon and in modern day Israel, what used to be known as the land of Canaan. And of course, the descendants, the Canaanites are descendants of a man named Canaan, who was Ham's son and would be Noah's grandson. Well, one of the branches of the family of Ham is depicted here as kind of a unique branch, and that is the Egyptians, who were descendants of Mitzrayim. And in fact, in Hebrew, Mitzrayim is it's the name of the country. So the country is named after that descendant of Ham. And of course, this branch of the population is those who were living in Egypt at the time the sojourn of the descendants of Shem, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived in Egypt. And like I said before, they went through good times and bad times, and ultimately that resulted in the Exodus. So this is kind of the bad guys in the story of the Egyptian bondage and captivity. Are these descendants of Ham, these Egyptians? Then down at the in the lower left-hand corner of the page, we have the ancestors of Yafet. And most of his descendants traveled kind of northwest up into Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey, and then into the eastern part of Europe. And so they are ancestors of the Gauls, Britons, Germans, Russians, Medes, Iberians, Greeks, Romans, and Thracians. And in Dr. Ead's picture, Yafet just kind of disappears and really doesn't come back into the picture significantly until the, I don't know, about 400 years prior to the New Testament era. And then, of course, when the followers of Yeshua, like the Apostle Paul, go out into the world to spread the gospel and make disciples of all nations, they will venture into Europe and encounter some of the descendants of Yafet. But the focus of the biblical story is on the descendants of Shem. And here's our red ribbon of redemption, the salvation story that goes through these four generations of the descendants of Ham, beginning with Avram and Yitzhak and Yaakov, and then all of the sons of Yaakov. And eventually the whole family ends up in Egypt during their time of captivity and bondage, and ultimate deliverance and release under the leadership of Moses. So these are the ancestors of the Persians, Assyrians, Chaldeans, which is just another name for the Babylonians, the Armenians, and then the Syrians. And these people will be very much involved in the adventures of the Semitic people, the ultimately known as the Jewish people, throughout the Old Testament period of time. We have Avram, and his story begins in a place called Ur of the Chaldees. And I will show you a map in a few minutes that will locate that place for you. It seems to be the birthplace of Avram. And the call of Avram here in Genesis 12, and it's repeated repeatedly in the life of Abram. The first call and the covenant that God makes with Abram is first given in Genesis 12, then it's repeated in 15, repeated in 17, repeated, I believe, in chapter 22, and various other places. So God makes these important promises to Abram. And let me just kind of sum up what is called the Abrahamic covenant. It consists of three important things, and I think we'll see this in the texts that we look at. God, of course, called Abram to leave his homeland, Ur of the Chaldees, and leave the home of his father and mother and travel to a land that God would show him. And it would turn out to be the land of Canaan, which ultimately would become the promised land. Because the first aspect of the threefold promise that God makes Abraham is this land that he would lead him to. And again, we'll look at maps, and so you can kind of get oriented geographically about where the promised land is. The second part of the promise is that Abraham will have many descendants, which will ultimately constitute a nation, a significant nation in the world's history. And this came as great news to Abraham, but something that it was difficult for him to doubt. Because when God made that promise to him, Abram was 75 years old. His wife, Sarai, was her name at that time. She was 65 years old. They had tried all their married lives to have children and were unable. So Sarah was barren and was well into her old age and past the time of childbearing. But God promised that those two would have children. And of course, those children would constitute the messianic line here and eventually bring the seed of woman into the world. And that is Jesus Christ. That's Yeshua, the Messiah, the Mashiach. And then the third part of the Abrahamic covenant is the promise of blessing. God said that he would bless Abraham and his descendants, and that they would ultimately be a blessing to the world. Especially through that special prophetic seed of woman, the Savior of the world, who would come from heaven to earth into this world as a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this is kind of the chosen and promised family. One aspect of the blessing of the Abrahamic covenant is God said that those who blessed Abram, or Abraham and his descendants, would be blessed by God. But those who cursed him and opposed him and were hostile to him would be under a curse by God. This Abrahamic covenant is an eternal covenant. It's an ongoing, persistent covenant that is still in effect nowadays. And you will notice that God has been faithful in keeping that promise, because those nations and those cultures that have been supportive and favorable and have blessed the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Jewish people and the nation of Israel, have fallen under God's blessing, and God has prospered them and protected them from harm and danger. But those nations, those cultures, those individuals who have opposed God's people are also opposed by God and encounter all kinds of disasters. And how many empires have risen and fallen because they took a position of opposition to God's chosen people. So here's a little Bible verse from Genesis 12. In thee, in Abram, shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And that blessing happens to all the families of the earth, all the nations of the world, in a variety of different ways. I mean, it can be spiritual blessings, it can be material blessings, it can be relational blessings, so many different ways. But the ultimate fulfillment of that is that the Messiah came through this family and blessed the whole world by providing salvation to the whole world. So that's kind of where we leave off with Abram. Abram and Sarah had to wait for 25 years from Abraham's age of 75 years old until the promise of offspring through his wife Sarah was fulfilled. In the meantime, Abraham produced a son by a maidservant in their household, and his name was Ishmael. That story is told in Genesis 17. And Ishmael happens to be the ancestor of the Arab race. Now, I know that a lot of kind of anthropologists, I guess, object to the idea that Ishmael is the ancestor of the Arab race. So I guess it would be more technically correct to say that Ishmael is the ancestor of the Ishmaelites, many of whom are Arabs from the region of Saudi Arabia. Then Abraham eventually does have a son of promise, Isaac, but Isaac also has a twin brother named Esau. And Esau turns out to be much less faithful than Isaac does, and Esau becomes the ancestor of the Edomites. And it might interest you to know that King Herod the Great, who was the king at the time that Yeshua was born, was a descendant of Esau. He was an Idumean, which in those days is what they called Edomites. So King Herod was not part of this chosen family. Then we have Jacob, and Jacob's name is crossed out. It doesn't mean that Jacob died and was replaced by Israel, but the reason his name is crossed out is that God changed his name to Israel. Israel is a Hebrew word that means technically and literally, it means to struggle as a prince and to overcome. So it's the royal struggle for power and vindication and victory in that struggle. So Jacob's name is changed to Israel. This also turns out to be not only his personal name, but it will be the name of the nation of Israel. And then in the course of his adventures, he becomes the father of 12 sons, and they are listed here. Reuben is the oldest, then Shimon, then Levi. Levi, by the way, will become the family from which the priests and the priestly assistants, the Levites, will come from. Then we have Judah, Yahudah, whose name means to praise. And notice that it is through this son that the red ribbon of redemption passes. So Judah is the chosen one. His family is the noble family, the kingly family of Israel. Then we have Issachar, Zvulun, we have Yosef or Joseph, and his younger brother Benjamin. We have Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Okay. One of the things that we need to appreciate is that all of these sons spent some time in Canaan. They just about all of them really hated their son Joseph, so they ended up selling him into slavery in Egypt, hoping and thinking that he would definitely suffer there, but ultimately they hoped that he would die there. And so Joseph goes down into Egypt before his brothers do. But as fate would have it, or as God would have it in his plan, a severe famine came upon the land of Canaan where these guys were living. The only hope they had for survival was to go down into Egypt and buy food, which they did on, I think, 3 occasions, purchasing food from Joseph before they came to realize who he actually was. Because Joseph had been through good times and bad times and ultimately had become the second most powerful man in Egypt. Our text here tells us that the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob or Israel, first were called Jews, which means people from Judah, from the tribe of Judah, after the Babylonian captivity. Now, this is kind of interesting because we throw around the term Jews all over the place, no matter what part of the Bible we're discussing. I will use that term frequently throughout these studies while we're in the Old Testament. But just be aware that as far as the Bible is concerned, this label of Jews doesn't come into use until much later in Old Testament history. At this period in history that we're looking at here, the Jewish people are basically known as the Hebrews because of the language that they spoke, probably because of their origin across the Euphrates River. They had to cross the Euphrates River to get to the Promised Land, and Iver or Eber, which we talked about last time, means to cross over, and it's also the name of the culture of the Hebrew people and the language that they speak. One other thing I want to point out is the chronology that Dr. Eid has provided for us here. He puts a stake in the ground at a significant date in Old Testament history, which was the Call of Abram. This first time that God called upon him and kind of mapped out his destiny for him in Genesis 12. And the date that Dr. Eid attaches to that is 1921 BC, before Christ, or BCE, if you prefer. And other biblical resources bear out the accuracy of that. And then the other date that he stakes out is the date of the Exodus at 1491 BC. I believe that, though both of those dates, I believe, are Bishop Ussher's dates, kind of the standard chronology of the Bible. And one of the things that you will notice here is a truth that the Apostle Paul brings out in the book of Galatians. And that is that there is a 430-year span between the call of Abram and the Exodus from Egypt. So if you would ask most Christians how long the Hebrews spent during the Egyptian captivity and bondage, they would say 400 years based on one interpretation of a particular Bible passage. But if they spent 400 years here in Egypt, then the time period that's the time left over for 4 generations to come into existence is only 30 years. So you really can't cram 4 generations, especially of lengthy lifespans, into just 30 years. So the 430 years is going to start with the shortly after the birth of the promised child, Isaac, when the Hebrews are living in the promised land, still not owning any of it, but they're living there. And when Isaac is just a young man, the 430 years begin, culminating with about 215 years in Egypt. So we have 215 years in Canaan, up in north in Syria, in Aram, where Jacob will live for a while and where he will raise his family, then back in the land of Canaan. About 215 years there in Canaan and various other places, and then another 215 years in Egypt. So let's look at, in some detail, at the history, the biblical history of this family of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Jacob, Israel, and then the descendants, the sons of Israel. I have taken the outline of this portion of history from the Ryrie study Bible produced by Charles Ryrie, a brilliant scholar, and I'm indebted to him for the chronology here, the outline of this portion of scripture that his study Bible provides. Just about any study Bible that you get will have outlines of the biblical history. So we start with the history of Avram. And we've already talked a little bit about it. I've got a picture here in the lower right-hand corner of the kind of the family tree of Abraham. The story begins with Terah, his father, and Terah had three sons, Haran, Nahor, and Avram. It also indicates that Avram was married to Sarai, which was also Terah's daughter by a different mother. Abram and Sarai had two different mothers, but the same father. And then Avram also produces a child by Hagar, the Egyptian maidservant. And that's where Ishmael comes from, and his descendants are the Ishmaelites. So we are told that this family, Terah and his three sons, left Ur of the Chaldees, which is right here on the map. And they traveled northwestwardly. Some people think they spent some time along the Tigris River. Others think they just followed the Euphrates River up to a place here called Haran. Another biblical name for this area or this region is Padan Aram. Aram is just the Hebrew Old Testament word for Syria. So this is modern day Syria. And we're told that Haran, the son of Terah, died and left only Nahor and Avram. And then when Terah died, then Abram continued the journey and went down here into the Promised Land. Of course, the Promised Land was the area that God wanted him to go to. It was the land he was going to give to him. One of the things that we will notice in the story that lies ahead of us is that Abram and Sarah, before they had any children, spent some time down in Egypt because of a famine. This is an earlier famine than the one that brought Joseph and his all of Joseph's brothers to see him in Egypt. But they spent some time in Egypt. And one of the things that we will learn from especially the promises that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was that the promised land, this land that God gave to them, is bordered on the west by the river of Egypt. And most believe that the river of Egypt is the Nile River, depicted here. And it's bordered on the north and the east by the Euphrates River, the great river Euphrates. So the promised land goes, it's most of what you see on the map. It goes from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates and includes most of the Middle East. And now God has promised this land to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they've never occupied all of it. And I think biblical prophecy tells us they won't until the millennial kingdom, which is a subject we will discuss in some great detail in the future. So when Abram finally left Haran, he left with his dead brother Haran's son Lot. So Lot would be the nephew of Avram. And he went down into the promised land with Abraham. And those two families, worked together for a long time. Lot had two daughters, and through an incestuous relationship, daughter one produced the Moabite peoples and daughter two the Ammonite peoples. Ammonites eventually became the Jordanian people, and then the Moabites were the Moabites. I think they kind of disappeared from the scene historically. So that's as far as we will trace the ancestry here. Just be aware that, of course, Abraham and Sarah have Isaac, and Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob's sons, Bilhah and Rachel, also daughters from the same family, will produce the 12 tribes of Israel. So that's the family of Abram. The call of Abram we've already talked about in Genesis 12, and the Abrahamic covenant, which is repeated. Then we have the separation of Abram and Lot. And the reason they separated really is because they both became so prosperous that the land, they were shepherds, and the land would not support two such enormous wealthy and prosperous families. So they decided, for the good of all, that they would separate. And Abraham gave Lot the opportunity to choose which direction that he wanted to go. Lot thought it would be a good idea to move down in the vicinity of Sodom and Gomorrah. So he moved there, and Abraham stayed up in the kind of the mountains of Judea and around Hebron. Then we have the story of deliverance of Lot by Abram. Lot kind of innocently ran into some trouble when there was a war between four kings from Babylon, which would be here on the map, and then five kings from down here in the Promised Land, around where Lot was living near Sodom and Gomorrah. So those 9 kings battled it out in the Promised Land, and the 4 kings beat the 5 kings, and Lot was taken hostage. And those 4 kings started back towards the north and the east with Lot as their hostage. Well, when Abraham found out about it, he rode to the rescue with his well-trained army of 318 kind of special forces warriors. If Abraham was able to wield an army of 318 people, that tells you how large his household was. So these would be young men trained for war. Abraham and his army pursued after the kidnappers of Lot. They caught them, they defeated them, rescued Lot and all of his possessions, and kind of returned Lot. Then I think I have something here on the next page. I may need to go one more page. On this slide, I just wanted to give you a couple of the repetitions of the Abrahamic covenant. And here's Genesis 12, 1-3 that we've already discussed. Here's the repetition of it in Genesis 15. And the most important part of the Abrahamic covenant here in Genesis 15 is this statement that God inspired in the scriptures, where he said, and he, that's Abram, believed in the Lord, and he, God, accounted it to him for righteousness. Now, we've already talked about the righteousness that God gives us by his grace through our faith in the promises of God. But here it is in black and white. And of course, that will be repeated throughout the scriptures. And this is really important when we're discussing the whole subject of the promises of God. This is about the best promise that can be given, that we can be righteous through faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then in Genesis 17, the covenant is repeated again by God. And it's in this repetition of the covenant that God establishes a sign of the covenant, and that is that all males in the family of Abraham are to be circumcised when they're 8 days old. And if they are converts from, some other population or religion, when they're older adults, then they still must be circumcised. So circumcision is the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. Okay, that brings us back to the story of Abraham rescuing Lot. And I wanted to tell you just one portion of this story. When Abraham had defeated these 5 kings from Babylon, from the east, and he was returning with the spoils of the victory, including his nephew Lot, whom he had rescued. When he returned to the Promised Land, he had a kind of a strange encounter with a fellow named Melchizedek. And I want to read from the text of Genesis 14, where Abram, after his victory, meets Melchizedek. And then we'll also want to see what the New Testament has to say about this person. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shavah, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Kedor Laomer and the kings who were with him. Those were the 4 kings of Babylon. Then Melchizedek, verse 18. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, um, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest of God Most High. That is, he was a priest of the one true God of the Bible. And he, Melchizedek, blessed Abram and said, "Blessed be Avram of Elohim, El Elyon, the Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands." He's talking about the victory of those 5 kings from Babylon. And he, Abraham, gave him, Melchizedek, a tithe of all the spoils of victory. So kind of a strange fellow, and the Bible doesn't say much more after that. The Old Testament mentions him in Psalm 110. But then in the book of Hebrews, we learn a little bit more about this Melchizedek in Hebrews 7, 1-3. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, and of course he was said to be the king of Salem. Interestingly enough, Salem is the last syllable of Jerusalem, and that seems to be where Melchizedek was living and where he was reigning as king of that city. He was priest of God Most High, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and he, Melchizedek, blessed Abram, to whom also Abram gave a 10th part of all. So we already know that from Genesis 14, but then it goes on to say, first, being translated king of righteousness. The name Melchizedek, Melchi means my king, and Sedek means righteousness, of righteousness. And then also king of Salem, the place where he lived. And Salem, or Shalom in Hebrew, means peace. So the name of the city where Melchizedek ruled was peace. It was Shalom. That was the name of the city. But then it goes on to say that Melchizedek was without father and without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God. He remains a priest continually. There's a lot of debate among scholars about what this means, without father and without mother. I will say that the two theologians that I respect the most both take the position that Melchizedek was human, and he did have a beginning and he did have an end, but the meaning of without father and without mother means that nobody knew what his genealogy was. That he had a genealogy, but nobody was aware of it. And this is a little surprising to me because these two guys are really faithful to the text of the scripture. And that explanation is not what the scripture says. The scripture says without father and without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. This is an eternal being. And so many scholars believe that this was an Old Testament example of a manifestation, probably of the second person of the Trinity, Yeshua, before he was born in Bethlehem, many hundreds of years later. That, in fact, Melchizedek was the Son of God. Again, an argument could be made that it says he was like the Son of God, so he can't be the Son of God, and that's just not the case. This is making a comparison with the Son of God, who we all know was Yeshua, and Melchizedek was like him in not having father, not having mother or genealogy, and not having beginning of days nor end of life. And really, I mean, if you think about it, Yeshua is the only kind of human person that meets those qualifications. And then Hebrews will tell us that Yeshua is a priest of the order of Melchizedek. We talked about the fact before that the family of Levi and the descendants of Aaron were the priestly family. But Yeshua was from the family of Judah, and priests don't normally come from that branch of the family tree unless you are the Son of God. unless you are kind of the ultimate king, of which the Levitical priests were, were only a type. I said king, but priest. Although Yeshua was a prophet, a priest, and a king. So I wanted to share these things with you about the deliverance of Lot by Abram. Then we have the covenant of Avram repeated in Genesis 15. This is where it says, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. After waiting quite a while for God to fulfill his promises of Abram and Sarai having a child, they decided to help God fulfill that promise by inviting Avram to sleep with Sarai's handmaid, an Egyptian named Hagar, and she did conceive and gave birth to Ishmael. And, but God said, to Abraham, that's your son. I love him. I'll bless him, but he's not the chosen son. He is not the descendant of the Messiah. We looked at the repetition of the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 17. That's where circumcision was implemented. Paul in the New Testament emphasizes that Abram was not Jewish. Again, Jews weren't called Jews till hundreds of years later. So Paul emphasizes that Abram was a Gentile when he received the covenant and the sign of the covenant of circumcision. Then we have the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in chapters 18 and 19. After Lot and Abraham separated, Abraham was visited by three individuals. Turns out to be one of those is Yahweh himself. The other two are angels. The Lord explains to Abram that a report has come to him about the immorality and the abominable sexual deviances that are going on in that city. So he sends the two angels to go down there and check it out. And if it's true, then God is going to bring judgment. It's very clear in the text, contrary to some modern interpretations of this, that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was homosexuality. And also sodomy is homosexual behavior, and it's named after this city. Those who want to vindicate homosexual behavior these days often say that there's a passage in the Bible where it says that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was inhospitality to strangers, like to the angels who came down to visit. But the very next verse refers to the sin of homosexuality in Sodom and Gomorrah as being toeva in Hebrew. It's an abomination to God. And that's why that city was destroyed. But before God destroyed the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, he wanted to get the faithful people out. He wanted to get the believers out. And Lot and his family were thought to be believers. So the angels went down there not only to destroy the city, but before they did that, to extract Lot and his family from Sodom and Gomorrah. And it was a tough break for that family. When the angels finally got them out of town, Lot's wife couldn't resist the city that she had left. She turned around and watched the judgment falling on her city. And according to God's warning, she was turned into a pillar of salt. Lot and his two daughters escaped Sodom. We're told that in an incident of incest, both of those daughters, who may have thought that the three of them, their dad and the two daughters, were the only humans left, thought it a good idea to get themselves impregnated by their father. So they got him drunk, and on two occasions he impregnated both of them, and that produced the Moabite branch of the family tree and the Ammonite branch of the family tree. We have a story in Genesis 20 of Abraham and Sarah spending time with Abimelech in a place called Gerar. I should have explained earlier in the expedition of Abram and Sarah to Egypt that when they had gone, these two are similar incidents. Abram and Sarah went down to Egypt in a time of famine, and before they got into the city, Abraham said to Sarah, "Do me a favor, and when we get to Egypt, be sure you tell everybody that you're my sister rather than my wife. Because if you're my wife, the men of Egypt are liable to really have some lustful desires for you, and they're liable to kill me so they can have their way with you. So do me a favor and say you're my sister, but that way they'll still have their way with you, but they'll spare my life." And she goes along with it. It's only a partial lie because, as we saw in the genealogy, Abram and Sarah were, in fact, brother and sister, or I guess we'd say stepbrother and sisters, because they had different mothers but the same father. And so a little bit later in their story, they go to Abimelech in Gerar. He's the king of that city. And they do the same routine. Sarah says that Abram is her brother, and so Abimelech is going to have his way with her and kind of pass her around the Gerarites, I guess you'd call them. But God speaks to him, warns him, and he realizes that she's not just his sister, but also his wife. And so he's pretty upset that he's been fooled by this ruse. But Abraham and Sarah do well. Both times when they leave Egypt and when they leave Gerar, they leave with all kinds of gifts and riches and wealth and stuff like that. Okay, we continue the story with the birth of Isaac. And Isaac is born to Abraham and Sarah when Abram is 100 years old and Sarah's 90 years old. So they've had to wait 25 years. And ultimately, God fulfilled the promise after a long wait, a long test of their faith. Genesis 22 is the story of the offering of Isaac. It's kind of a bizarre story, but an important one because it really is kind of a stage play, kind of a drama of how the redemption of mankind is going to take place. So early in chapter 22, the Lord says to Abram, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, to a place where I will point out to you in the mountains of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering." A burnt offering is a sacrifice, normally an animal sacrifice, that is completely consumed by fire. There's no meal or anything that's eaten there, so it's just a totally destroyed sacrifice, and of course it results in death. And Abraham knows God's voice. He's heard it so many times, and though it must have broken his heart, must have caused all kinds of doubts, he's faithful and he's obedient, and he does what God tells him to do. So he takes him up to this mountaintop. He builds an altar, places the wood on it. He's about to sacrifice his son, and an angel tells him to stop, that it was all a test to see if Abraham would obey. The angel points out a ram, a sacrificial animal caught by its horns in a nearby bush. And so Abraham, probably with great relief and joy, takes his son off the altar, and the substitute, the lamb, caught by its horns in the bushes, is offered as an animal sacrifice. And we've already talked about the importance of these animal sacrifices and what they symbolize. A huge significance of this story is that so much of it is similar to the story of the offering of Yeshua, of Jesus Christ, for the sins of the world. Isaac is referred to as the son of God. I think the Hebrew text even says the only begotten son of God. Isaac is referred to as the only begotten son of Abraham. There is, of course, the wood of the sacrifice that Isaac is required to carry up to the top of Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah happens to be the mountain range on which Jerusalem was positioned many generations later, and that it's the same place where Yeshua was offered. The idea of the substitute for the sins of mankind is emphasized in Genesis 22, and of course, Yeshua, Jesus, the Son of God, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, is our substitute. So a lot of important parallels there, a lot of important patterns. After that, Sarah dies, and Abraham buys a parcel of land. It's really the only land in the Promised Land that Abraham owns, and it was a cemetery plot. It was a field with a cave in it that Abraham could use as a burial place for Sarah. So he buys it from, I think it's Ephron, the Hittite, for a goodly piece of money, but it's Abraham's property. Comes time for the marriage of Isaac, and Abraham sends one of the household servants. We later come to know that his name is Eleazar, up to Padan Aram, up to the household of the extended family up in Haran, to find a son for Isaac. And there the servant encounters Rebekah and invites her to return with him to the Promised Land, to the land of Canaan, and be a wife for Isaac. She agrees to that. She comes south, lives with Isaac. They get married. They're very much in love. After the death of Abraham, that's described in 25, 1 through 11. There's a genealogy of the descendants of Ishmael, although he's not the promised child and the ancestor of the Messiah. Again, God loved him and blessed him and prospered him. Then we have the history of Isaac and his sons. His sons are going to be Jacob and Esau, twins. Interestingly enough, Sarah was barren before God miraculously allowed her to conceive and bear a son. And Rebekah was also barren. And so Isaac and Rebekah prayed about that, and she did conceive, perhaps miraculously. She conceived twins, Jacob and Esau. Esau was technically the oldest, but before the two were born, God told Rebekah that the older would serve the younger. So Jacob would end up being the, kind of fulfilling the role, I guess, of the oldest son, even though he technically was not. The way he accomplished that was kind of tricking his brother out of his birthright. One day, Jacob was busy cooking, and Esau, who was a great hunter, came back from an unsuccessful hunting trip, and he was so hungry, so famished, that he was willing to give probably his most precious possession, which was the birthright in the family, the right of the eldest son. He was willing to sell that to Jacob for a bowl of stew. We have Isaac and Abimelech. Isaac and his wife Rebekah went down and visited. It's not the same Abimelech that Abraham and Sarah visited. Abimelech is probably a title rather than a name, so it's probably the name of the king of Gerar. They went down there too, and Isaac pulled the same stunt that his dad did. He asked Rebekah to tell them that Rebekah was his sister rather than his wife, and this is the third cycle of that story going around, kind of like father like son. Then we have the blessing of Jacob by deception. When Isaac was very old and his eyesight had failed him, Isaac had sent Esau out into the fields and to go hunting and get him some game and prepare it the way his dad liked it before, Isaac felt like he was going to be dying soon. And he wanted to bless his sons before that. So he wanted a good meal before he blessed Esau. So he sent him out hunting. But Rebekah had been eavesdropping, and so she disguised Jacob as Esau and prepared that tasty dish. And it turned out that Jacob got the blessing that Esau was intended to get, or at least Isaac intended to give him the blessing. But God always intended for Jacob to get it, probably not by deception. God would probably had another method in mind, but Jacob ended up with the birthright and the blessing, and both of those were kind of achieved by crooked means, kind of unfair, cheating means. Well, when Esau gets back from the field, he discovers what's happened, and he's angry enough with his brother that he wants to kill him. So Jacob flees for his life back to Padan Aram, back to the family estate up there in Syria. That's the place where Eleazar had found a bride for Isaac, and that's where Jacob hoped to find a bride also. So Jacob leaves town. He sleeps overnight at Bethel, has a vision of heaven where God kind of extends the Abrahamic covenant to Jacob, to that third generation of the seed of Abraham. God tells him that he gives him just a absolutely brilliant display of heavenly glory, and promises to be a God to him, and invites Jacob to faithfully follow him. Jacob finally arrives at Padan Aram, meets the daughters of Laban. He falls in love with Rachel, just head over heels. She must have been really gorgeous. Falls in love with her, wants to marry her. Laban tells Jacob that he can have Rachel as his wife if he will work for him for 7 years. Jacob agrees. He certainly gets Rachel as his wife before the 7 years, but then I think there was a week that he had to wait, kind of a down payment on the 7 years of work. Then he's given his bride, but he's obligated to work for the full 7 years. So after that week of down payment, I guess, as on the bride price, they have a big wedding ceremony, and Jacob wakes up in the morning and discovers that it was Leah that was the older sister that was in his bed, and not Rachel. So he knows that he's been tricked. Leah and Rachel's dad, Laban, is just as much of a trickster as Jacob is. So Jacob, of course, is furious because he wanted Rachel. He wanted the pretty one. And so he confronts Laban about that. Laban explains that in their culture, it's inappropriate for the younger daughter to marry before the older daughter. So that's why he had to get Leah first. But he assures him that if he'll work another 7 years, he can get Rachel for his bride. And Jacob loves her so much that he's willing to do that. So with a 14-year work obligation, he marries both gals. Jacob begets children, and the story of the childbearing of these gals is kind of interesting. When Jacob married Leah, Laban also gave to Jacob Leah's maidservant. Her name was Zilpah. And when he got Rachel a little bit later, Laban also gave Rachel's servant Bilhah to him. Now, the Bible is very clear that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. Leah was not nearly as pretty. The Bible makes that clear. But Leah was fertile. She had lots of children, and Rachel was barren. So every generation so far of this family has had barren women. So Leah starts having children. Her firstborn is Reuben, then Simeon, then Levi, and Yahudah, um, who's the ancestor of the Messiah. Then she stops off bearing, and Rachel's all upset because she's behind by 4. So she makes a similar arrangement with her maidservant Bilhah that Abraham had made, or that Sarah had made with Abraham and Hagar. So Bilhah sleeps with Jacob and has Dan and Naphtali. And then Leah sees that arrangement, thinks, well, that's a good idea. I'm not having any kids anymore. So she matches up Jacob with Zilpah, and Zilpah has Gad and Asher. And finally, after all these births are taking place, Issachar and Zvulun are born. Those are Leah's children. She had 6 kids. Each one of the maidservants had 2. And finally, God has mercy on Rachel, and she conceives and gives birth to Joseph. He is her firstborn, but he is the 11th of 12 sons. Benjamin is his younger brother. But then Rachel dies in childbirth when she gives birth to Benjamin. So because Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife, Joseph is the favorite son. Benjamin comes in a close second, and all these other sons are extremely jealous. So let's see. Jacob begets children. Jacob bargains with Laban, and basically he works the full 14 years to have his 2 wives. But then Laban talks him into staying there another 6 years. And during that 6 years, God prospers Jacob even more than his master Laban. And so he becomes very rich and wealthy and powerful and influential with livestock. Then finally, the point comes when there's, I guess you would just have to say that the time had come for Jacob and his family to leave Haran, to leave Padan Aram, and go back to the promised land, as God had indicated was his will. So he turns south. He's going to go back to the promised land. He knows that he's going to have to confront Esau, and he's very nervous about it because the last he heard, Esau wanted to kill him. Well, it's been 20 years. So he has high hopes that maybe Esau's anger has lessened, but he's still very nervous about it. So Jacob kind of leaves suddenly from Laban, and he does meet up with Esau. And fortunately, Esau's anger has lessened, and they kind of reconciled and become good buds and everything. So it's kind of a happy ending there. But before Jacob meets with Esau, it's like the night before that happens. He has a wrestling match at night with a mysterious person who appears to be God himself. And Jacob really affords himself well in this wrestling match. He's winning. And when it comes right down to it, the Son of God, which is the person of the Trinity, I think this was, that was in the wrestling match, really almost has to bargain with Jacob to get away. So that's where Jacob's name gets changed to Esau. The guy he wrestled with, the Lord himself, changes his name. But the story continues with Jacob's later life. One of the things that happens in the, I guess we would call it the Promised Land years, the neo-promised land years for Jacob. He's back in the promised land. And one of the things I did not mention is that in addition to these 12 sons, Jacob also had a daughter named Dinah. And while they're living in Shechem, a young man named Hamor falls in love with Dinah and really forces his affections on her and rapes her and disgraces her. So Jacob is naturally upset about this. His brothers are even more upset about this. She was a daughter of Leah. And so Levi and Simeon, I believe, are the two who decide to take vengeance on Shechem. So first of all, they kind of trick Hamor and his dad in the city they live in. And they say, because Hamor was serious about this girl, he wanted to marry her. He wanted his dad to arrange for it. And so the sons of Jacob strike a deal and say, well, we'll allow the marriage. And in fact, we'll allow an exchange of sons and daughters of our two tribes, I guess you'd call it, if you Gentiles are willing to be circumcised. So all the men of the city agree to it. The Israelite girls must have been really attractive that they were willing to do that. So while they were healing up from their circumcision, Shimon and Levi led the other brothers into attacking this city, and they killed everybody. And they took all of their cattle and their possessions. And of course, after that, Jacob and all of his sons, they had to leave town because they had really done, a very violent and immoral thing. Jacob eventually goes back to Bethel, where he first had his vision by God. He builds an altar there. We encounter the death of Rachel. Rachel died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin, a great tragedy for Jacob. Isaac eventually dies. We have the descendants of Esau in a genealogy in chapter 36. We have the history of Joseph in chapters 37 through 50. We talked about the jealousy already between Joseph, Jacob's favorite, and all the other brothers. It seems like as time goes on, they hate him all the more until eventually he is so much of a thorn in their flesh that they sell him to some Ishmaelite, Midianite traders that are on their way to Egypt. They sell him into slavery, thinking that he'll certainly die in Egypt and they'll be done with him. There's a very strange chapter inserted into the story of Judah, and I can't really explain why it's there. Judah had 3 sons, and he found a wife for his oldest son. Her name was Tamar. And so Tamar married his oldest son, but this son was displeasing to God, so God struck him dead. The second son then married Tamar, and God struck that one dead too. So Judah was probably having some reservations about giving his third son, his youngest son, to this gal. But he had the excuse that he was too young for her. So he said to Tamar, if you just wait a few years until, my son reaches adulthood, then I'll arrange for the marriage and you guys will live happily ever after. But that youngest son grew up and Judah wasn't keeping his promise. So Tamar kind of played a trick on him. She dressed up like a prostitute. Judah slept with her and she conceived. And then, she finally kind of confronted him. Judah admitted that he had cheated her and actually attributed more righteousness to Tamar than he had himself. Tamar was a Gentile. And so she conceived and gave birth to Judah's sons, not his son's sons, but to Judah's sons. And it turns out that when we look at the genealogy of the Messiah, Tamar and her sons are in the genealogy. For a woman to be mentioned in a genealogy is extraordinary, but when she's a Gentile and when she's played the role of a prostitute, she wasn't a prostitute, but she kind of dressed up like one. It's even more extraordinary. So maybe that's why this story is here. Joseph does arrive in Egypt. He is bought by a noble in the Pharaoh's court. that noble is named Potiphar. Potiphar is, most of our English Bibles say he was an officer in the court, but the Hebrew text says he was a saris, which is a eunuch. He was a castrated male. And so Potiphar's wife was probably not very well satisfied. And Potiphar buys Joseph, brings him into his household, gives him a lot of responsibility, actually treats him very well. But the tragedy is that Potiphar's wife falls in love with Joseph and makes repeated passes at him. Joseph resists. He maintains his honor and integrity before God and before his master, Potiphar, whom he honors. And it finally gets to the point where she has been rejected so many times that she accuses Joseph of rape, and he ends up in prison. So things are going from bad to worse for Joseph. First of all, he's a slave sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt, and then he goes to jail for a crime he didn't commit. While he's in jail, God blesses him with the ability to interpret dreams. One of the dreams that he interprets, one of the experiences of interpreting dreams, is when the butler and the baker of the Pharaoh are also thrown into prison, and they have dreams, and Joseph interprets them, and his interpretations of their dreams turn out to be accurate. So Joseph establishes credibility as kind of a prophet and interpreter of dreams. Later on, during Joseph's imprisonment, Pharaoh has a dream about the severe famine that's coming on the land, on the whole region, including the land of Canaan. And Joseph accurately interprets the dream. Pharaoh was so impressed that he makes him kind of the prime minister of Egypt. The dreams had to do with this famine, and Joseph came up with a great idea about how the Egyptians and the surrounding regions could survive this severe famine, and Pharaoh's impressed with that, so he puts him in charge of the survival project. The famine comes as predicted. Joseph's brothers, his family, are starving, so they make a couple of trips down to Egypt to buy food, because Joseph has this plan of storing grain during the prosperous years. So there's food available. They go down to Egypt a couple of times, get themselves in trouble, but Joseph is really kind of setting them up. The first visit is in chapter 42. Then there's a second visit with 11 of the brothers. Finally, I think it's in the third visit, maybe it's in the second, that Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers. And they must have been terrified. They thought he was dead, and here they discover he's alive. And not only that, but he's very powerful, and their lives are in his hands. And they are probably sure that he will take out his vengeance on them and punish them, probably kill them in the most painful imaginable way. But Joseph looks at it differently. He explains this as, his being sold into slavery and coming down to Egypt before his brothers was all part of God's plan, so that all of them could survive, and that God could fill his promises about building a nation. So Joseph and his brothers turn out to be the kind of the branch of the family tree that will, in the 215 years that they're in Egypt, will become populous enough to be a nation. So the family of Joseph settles in Egypt in a very lush and a good part of the land, especially for shepherds, the land of Goshen, the best of the lands, which is in the northeast corner of Egypt. Jacob blesses the blessing of his sons. This is Joseph's sons. Joseph marries while he's in Egypt. He marries an Egyptian gal and has two sons, and their names are Ephraim and Manasseh. And Jacob, reunited with Jacob, he kind of adopts those two grandsons as his own sons. And those two will become tribes. Those two will become kind of regional governors of the tribal areas of Israel. Jacob's blessing of the sons, Jacob naturally wants to give the double blessing to the oldest, but God has different ideas. I'm sorry, Joseph wanted the oldest of his sons to be blessed with a double blessing, but God and Jacob have different ideas. So the younger is blessed over and above the older. Finally, Jacob dies in Egypt and is buried. His body is returned to the land of Canaan, where he is buried in the same place where his father and mother and other relatives are buried. Joseph leads the burial procession and returns to Egypt to kind of fulfill their destiny in Egypt, and Joseph eventually dies there too and is embalmed in Egypt. But he makes his brothers promise that when he dies, that his body will be returned to the promised land. He wants to be buried in the place where his family, his descendants, or his ancestors are buried, and that happens. And Genesis 50 is the last chapter of Genesis. And although we could probably say more about the Exodus, I think we'll reserve that for our next session. So let me end our study on the age of promise with the blessing. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all. Amen.